are when they get a minute. Thank you all for coming back for a second hour this week. I hope some of you were here last week when we talked a lot about faith and politics and the connectedness of the two, and we'll talk some more about that now. I think all of you probably know, but to my left is Jennifer Granholm, who was governor of Michigan from 2002 to 2010, and to her left is her husband, Dan Mulhern, who has written a couple of books on leadership. Together, they've written a book called A Governor's Story about her time as governor, and they are both now teaching at Cal, so that's why we've got them here, and we're going to take advantage of it. So I wanted to talk, last time we talked a lot about religion and politics, and often that breaks down into kind of left and right, and those are two different communities, obviously, different religiously, different politically, frequently. But it does seem to me that too often people of faith on the left and right end up sort of pointing fingers at each other, denouncing each other, disliking each other. And I'm curious about, maybe we'll start on a more positive note, and the ways in which those two communities can come together and make common cause on certain issues and try to understand each other and work together. So I wonder if, Governor, start off, can you talk a little bit about, maybe there's a specific example or two, ways in which you as a Democrat were able to come together and work with people of faith who are more conservative, Republicans, whatever they were. How did you bridge that gap?
Yeah, I would say there's two examples that pop to mind when you say that. One is in prison and justice reform. So, for example, the folks who are with what was Chuck Colson's prison ministry have really taken on the issue of justice reform very seriously and are working in the states to achieve smart prison reform policies. And in Michigan, for example, we had something called the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative, where we worked directly with the faith communities around the state to create a wraparound service for those who were reentering into the community. And as a result, it was a very comprehensive program, but without getting into too many specifics, but the right and the left were able to declare victory because we achieved a 37% reduction in recidivism rates. I closed 13 prisons as governor, more than any state in the country. So you have the confluence of sort of reparative justice as well as savings, smart, not putting your money on the backside, but on the front side of trying to prevent crime from happening. So that, to me, is a great example of where the right and the left can come together to achieve common purpose. And the second is, and this is something that we saw in Michigan, but that I think it has huge potential in a second Obama term. And I say second because I really do believe that he will be elected on Tuesday, re-elected on Tuesday. I know this is not a partisan conversation, but
that's the way to get applause in Berkeley. Yeah,
right. But I think that the right has really focused a lot on empowering the states, right? States' rights, et cetera. And the left has really wanted to see a national energy policy. And Dan and I wrote about this in our book, that if you can combine the desire to take care of God's planet and have the United States lead on this with a policy that empowers the states to do that, or incentivizes the states to do that, then I think you can achieve national energy policy that's not top-down but bottom-up. And by that I mean, if you remember when the administration put out Race to the Top on education, and what they did was they put $4.5 billion worth of a pot of money that the governors and the states had to compete for, but the price to enter that competition was that every state had to raise its high school standards to essentially be a college prep curriculum where you had 4 years of math, 3 years of science, 4 years of English, et cetera. So any state that wanted to compete had to do that as the price to entry, and then they had to achieve a bunch of other reforms. You could do, I'm just telling you, Republican and Democratic governors are very competitive with one another. And if there were a pot, and they're also very cash hungry, and they also want to create jobs in their states. So if you had a pot of money that you put on the table and said, governors, as a price to entry, you at a minimum have to have a certain percentage of your energy that you get from renewable sources, and then you configure your state's energy policy based upon the resources that you have there. If you're in Arizona, you want to focus on solar energy. If you're in Utah, you might want to focus on geothermal. If you're on one of the coasts, you might want to focus on offshore wind. Whatever that is, come to the table with how you can maximize your resources to compete for this pot of money. I'm telling you, you would have a national energy policy where right and left came together.
And go ahead, Andy. Do you want to?
Do you want to make your comment?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
And then I want to follow up on
Okay. So I think that it would be really interesting to think about a Secretary of Energy who had this kind of political vision, and who also, Ethan, to your point and the topic, connected issues of stewardship from left and right, which we talked a little bit about last week, that there's been a good deal of movement in the conservative Christian movement about sustainability of the earth, and that we were given stewardship. They're very biblical about that, and that we have a deep, profound right, so a responsibility to advance that stewardship of the earth. So I think it would be interesting to have a Secretary of Energy or someone like that who had both a compelling science view on the one hand and also a profound faith view on the other hand. Okay, wait, do you want to jump in on that? Go ahead, because I want to go somewhere else.
You're going to go somewhere else, but I just want to put as a caveat, we have a fabulous Secretary of Energy who's from here, from Berkeley, obviously a Nobel Prize winner. So the comment...
It's just imagination.
It's just an imagination.
Okay, so...
But if he were to leave, then maybe Dan would have a suggestion for a nominee during the second term. But anyway.
Yeah, right. That would be another story. So, but Jennifer and I are very outside-inside in terms of Jennifer's looking at moving big pieces, and in terms of the left and the right, what big pieces on the board could they move to make this a better country? I've always been an inside guy, so I want to make 2 points about your question. Number one is relationships matter, and number two is your relationships matter. So in my experience in Lansing, in a state capital in Michigan, there was a prayer group, and it was bipartisan, and they met once a month, legislators I'm talking about, but they invited me to participate, and there was a guy from the outside who this was his vocation, and his ministry was to try to build faith communities in state capitals and in Washington as well. I think those relationships really matter, and I think those discussions and that time together talking about what matters allows, when the Jennifer Granholms come along, the Governor Granholms come along and say, here's this prison entry initiative, when there's a conversation already happening about faith and about when did you see me in prison? When you visited me in prison, when you visited the stranger in prison, you visited me. My scripture cites are rough and crude. Sorry about that. You get where I'm going with that. So I think that matters, and I think cultivating that matters, especially now when there's such a sense of division and such a sense of scarcity, which accentuates that. And the second point I would make is I would say I think we should start here. Your relationships matter. And so I would say, instead of writing a letter to a congressperson or to the president, or being active in some way on your own as a left-wing Christian, if that's what you are, or a conservative Christian, if that's what you are, that I think people need to build those bridges and say, we're writing together, or we're both here to see you. Because it's of concern to both of us what's happening to children, or what's happening with prison, or what's happening with guns, and the fact that there are incredible tools of violence on the street that are being used on our own people. Or we're concerned that our country leads the world in imprisonment of 2.5 million people in prison. And she's a conservative, and I'm a liberal, and it's of concern to both of us.
That's not really true, but he's just a point of illustration.
I don't think we needed to explain that. So I think we have a responsibility, and politicians lead, but politicians overwhelmingly follow. And so unless we create the groundswell, unless we write the articles, unless we say things that change the environment, they'll keep doing what they keep doing. And the basic default tendency right now is to split up, and gridlock is the biggest fear that that overwhelms an Obama or a Romney administration, I think. So how do we, as citizens, not put fuel on those fires, but force people to come together for what matters to us?
And that actually leads perfectly to what I wanted to follow up with you, Governor, which is that let's talk about those personal, individual relationships. You talked about policy things where the left and the right can come together, but I'm curious how deep the divide is. When you were governor, could you go to a conservative megachurch and speak, or is that divide so deep that just can't be done? How do you bridge that sort of one-to-one, personally?
It's interesting. A lot of the conservative megachurches won't let somebody like me come and speak. But if you come on a policy that church is open to, and you're not talking about politics, then there is openness. For example, we created a mentoring initiative where we really recruited through churches. And so every Sunday, we were sent to churches all across the state to try to get people to step up and mentor a child. We worked in conjunction with Big Brother, Big Sister, and the goal was to get 10,000 mentors for 10,000 kids across the state. We ended up getting 15,000 mentors, largely through the effort with churches, completely nonpartisan. And so there is an opportunity, if you frame it in terms of a policy or an issue, that the right and the left, the conservative and the liberal churches, the church community, you frame it around Jesus, and then you can get movement.
But I think, Ethan, I was trying to be somewhat hopeful and inspirational on the first question. On this one, a dose of reality is that I spoke in tons and tons of churches about mentoring, and we recruited many, many people. But at one point, I wrote my archbishop, my cardinal, and said, I'm Catholic. I come out of this tradition. Can we sit down and talk about things that our church can do? And I never got an answer to that. Jennifer was asked to speak on a couple of occasions at Catholic schools, and then people went crazy, and they pulled the invitation because of her views on abortion. So we have a long way to go, I think, just in our churches to ask WWJD, what would Jesus do? How do we put all of this together? So I think there's great divisions, and we experience that even in our own church.
Coined, of course, as a liberal phrase, what would Jesus do initially, and then now transformed into people think of that as a conservative phrase, a kind of a strange twist. And you talked about mentoring. I know you have some students here, right? You have 3 of your students here?
Yeah, 3 of my great students.
Excellent.
A couple of my law students.
Shout out for Cal here.
Right.
But I think you mentioned earlier that they're interested in the connection between faith and politics in a very personal way, and the ways in which, as individuals, faith sustains your politics, but perhaps politics also influences your faith or changes your sort of faith journey, and the way those intertwine. Can you talk about that a little bit? Particularly, I guess, I'm curious, are there ways in which your public lives have changed your faith practices, your faith? Have they influenced how you think about religion and faith? Either one of you can jump into this.
Want me to go?
Well, I'll tell the first story about the connection, and then Jen can jump in there. Jennifer and I, Jennifer's from here, I'm from Michigan, and we met when we were in law school in Boston, and fell in love very quickly, and entered into our marriage prep with the pastor of our Catholic church. In that situation, I think it still is the expectation that you have 3 meetings with a priest before you get married. And the first 2 meetings were really, really great meetings, and totally improbable and implausible that this 35-year-old handsome priest who sat at his desk while we talked to him asked us all these really great questions, like, how do you handle money? Did your parents fight? Like really mundane sort of stuff, which of course is really important. Well, in the 3rd session we walked in, we had hardly sat down, and he said, Dan, you 2 are going back to Michigan, and you want to run for office. He said this to me, because that was the plan. Big Catholic family in Michigan, my home, Jennifer following with me. He said, what happens in 8 or 10 years if the party comes to Jennifer and they say, we have an open Senate seat, you'd be really great, you know, you're a Harvard Law student, and you've been to Berkeley, and you're very smart, and you're attractive in every sense of the word. And he said, how would that make you feel?
And I said, no way would I want to run for office.
That's true. That is exactly true. And I said, I think that would be really hard, because I think I'd be jealous, and I'd have to deal with, you know, my own issues about that. But I said, if I felt like God was calling her to do that, that I would be 110% behind her. And the odd thing was, he had everything right except the office. So 8 or 10 years later, we were driving to Chicago to see some law school friends of ours, and we had this conversation. You know, should you go for Attorney General? There's this great opening, and our kids were 7, 8, and 1, I think, at the time, and we both knew what that would take. Well, we didn't know, but we thought we knew. So, and I said I would be behind her. And so, I mean, to me, that was really an incredible experience of God appearing in a way, and that priest having that prescient moment to be able to see what might happen and to confront me or both of us. But I always felt like I had planted a flag on that day, you know, and I'd put my stake in the ground and said, if this happens, this is where I'll be. So that was forever, to this day and beyond, I hope. Kind of the guiding principle is what is God calling you to do? And that would serve to be very helpful.
And this is a parenthetical, especially for the young people who might be considering running for office. I think that the best advice that I give to anybody running for office is to choose your spouse well. Not kidding you, not kidding you. Because, you know, I certainly, I mean, poor Dan has been through a lot and still is strong and supportive, and I lean on him and have leaned on him for 25
talk about
years.
Your faith journey a little bit and how politics, because
get back on set.
I actually want to know where this priest is now, because I could use some stock tips, and this guy apparently knows the future. So, you know.
Father John McGinnis.
Yeah, where do we find him? But anyway, no, talking about, yes.
Well, I'm not sure what you meant by that, but I do think that the public side definitely encroached on the private side in many ways in terms of faith. So, for example, when I was governor, we got a visit in my office in the Romney building in Michigan from the bishop. And the bishop wanted to meet with me personally. I invited Dan to the meeting. And he told me that I was not welcome to have communion in the Catholic Church. And so I said to him, we said to him, and you fill in the blanks, because Dan really argued with him a lot, said, you know, does that mean that you're going to have this conversation with every other Catholic pro-choice Democrat in the Capitol building? And he said, well, I hope that they get the message, essentially. And I said, so does this just extend to what I believe the role of government should be in enforcing a woman's choice, or does it extend to other things, too, that the Catholic Church has held as doctrine? Like, are you going to have this conversation with the politicians in Michigan who believe there should be stem cell research, for example, because that was on the ballot? And are you going to have this conversation with conservative Democrats who want to see the death penalty in Michigan? Or are you going to have this conversation with those politicians who've been divorced? Or how far does this extend? And you know I said to him, and Dan was primed for this, but I said to him, you know, it's just from a political perspective, it's not a very good strategy for the church. I'm just thinking of expanding the church's base, and I'm like, nobody's going to be able to come to church anymore if none of us are welcome.
Well, and this bishop told us in the course of the conversation that it wasn't easy for him, and it wasn't easy for him, being one of 6 children, to not give communion, to tell one of his sisters not to come offer herself for communion because she was divorced and hadn't had it annulled. So that's sort of what you're dealing with in terms of a left brain, right brain kind of judgmentalism. But I guess the other point I want to raise, and especially I have 3 students here, as Jennifer alluded, all of whom have some interest in politics. And I hear from people all the time, from young people all the time. Perhaps you have children or nieces or nephews or grandchildren, and say, who would ever get in this game now? Why would you ever do it? Why would you expose your family to what you're exposing your family to? Why would you say, people can follow me around everywhere, every email I've ever written, every Facebook, for the young people, every Facebook picture I've ever posted? And I think that really turns for me, and I think Jen, she can speak to it in her own way, to the importance of faith and to the importance of having a faith community. So even though our own faith community, which one would hope would be a haven, wasn't exactly a haven, as we talked about last week, because of Jennifer's views on life, it was really a tough place, although our pastors were very, very supportive.
Right. The end of the story is that we told our priest that the bishop had visited us, because we said to the bishop, does that mean you're going to tell our priest that we're no longer welcome? And he said, no, this is between us, he said. But I said, so we went to our priest and we said, we just, in all candor, we want to let you know that he came and said this to us.
I don't actually, can I interrupt you for a minute? Because I think factually he did not say whether he would talk to the priest. And I was wishing you hadn't asked him, because I didn't want it to be pushed to that level. He fudged the question about, well, he might or might not talk to the priest, but this was an issue between you and God, and in his teaching role, he felt he was obliged to ask you. But I went to Father Mark, our pastor, because I didn't want Jennifer to ask. I didn't want her to hear no. And he basically said, I have a boat, because he loves to sail. He's got a little boat. And he said, if the cardinal asked me to not give you communion, he said, I would be gone. I would be on my boat and I would be done. And when people protested once outside the church there on campus, he gave, we weren't there that day, but he apparently gave a very fiery sermon about, he who has not sinned, throw the first stone, and about a church of understanding and compassion and inquiry, and supporting people in making difficult moral choices, not casting stones. So we've had great support from
We love the progressive
people.
Catholic priests.
Yeah.
Well, Governor,
and the nuns, too. God bless them.
Governor, you can come take communion with us whenever you want. So,
You won't reject me.
Come anytime.
But we had Jennifer, when she started, went and met with state employees. So she would go to areas like Grand Rapids, to Pat's home, where there were a lot of state employees, and just yeah, we were there. We were looking for you, but you weren't there. And just met with people. A woman walked up to me. This was when Jennifer was first inaugurated. She walked up to me, and she said, I'm a state employee. I work in such and such a department. She said, I'd like to pray for you. What shall I pray for? And I said, well, the fact that you would pray for us means a lot. I'm really grateful that you would do that. I was touched because she was really present, to me. And she said, no, what shall I pray for? I'd like to have a specific intention, which I wasn't really used to that or anything. But I said, well, then pray for our children who are young, and that they, be protected and shepherded through the process. And, thank God they were, despite being adolescents, 2 of them, and making the kinds of decisions adolescents make. None of that was splattered in newspapers or anywhere else, and they were largely protected. But I say that to say that was really significant and meaningful to me. And this guy who reached out and pulled me into the prayer community and put it into a broader context, that was very powerful. And what I was saying to Jennifer this morning is, as I told the story about Father Mark, faith was always the way we understood our lives, that was the main theme of understanding our life, is what does God expect from us, what are we supposed to do in community. Matthew, which chapter? 25. I got it wrong last week.
37th and on.
So that was a really important way. But we were also overachievers from Berkeley and Harvard and blah, blah, blah. And so there's a story of, an American story of get better and achieve more and achieve more and achieve more. And all of our Berkeley students, we can see this. They want to achieve, 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 accomplish. And that's the dominant main story in America. But the Christian story is very different than that. And I'm struck at how often in the Gospels things happen. Was it here last week where James and John say, or James and John's mother says, you know, hey, can one of them sit at your right and one of them sit at your left? And there's this constant issue of status and of who's most important. But the Christian story is really different. And so I would just say that it was a grueling 8 years. And Jennifer and I, in some ways, are still grieving from how hard it is to make an impact, how much grief you run into, how little people understand the complexity. We were at dinner last night with a guy who was just railing on the president. You know, I felt like, God, do you have any idea what he's dealing with? Okay, so you run a successful business. Good for you. You return margins on the bottom line every day. That is so easy. It's hard, really, really hard. But multiply it by 1,000 to be a president or a governor. So the point I'm trying to make in my labored way is that our faith, I know, was hugely important to us. And that if you have children, nephews, other people who are interested in politics, their faith is so important as a relationship to God, but also in community to have people who support you. And to support people is really important. To watch Jennifer, it is a lonely, lonely, lonely trek. And when people actually do support their leaders, it really matters. And where you have people who are great political leaders, budding political leaders, presidents, I think praying for them and supporting them is enormously, enormously important and underestimated. Because you really, for 8 years, I think Jennifer picked up her cross and walked with it. And it was agonizing.
But it was the cross of the state, you know. It was the cross of people who saw their jobs leave through no fault of their own. It was a cross. It wasn't my cross, you know. It was the cross of others. And perhaps that made it all the heavier and all the more important, and especially in tough times. And that's why faith, the internal side, the prayers, you know, just simple prayers like, you know, the prayer of St. Francis, you know, the notion every week when we would go to church and you would hear, essentially, what I would hear is, it's not about you. It is about the changes that you want to make on behalf of other people. You are here for a purpose, and the purpose is not yourself. The purpose is others. And that was incredibly empowering.
And how did you, Dan, I'm curious, you mentioned something interesting there, which is that one of the dominant strains of America is achieve, 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 and you said you two were overachievers, true? Right. And yet the Christian story is somewhat different than that, true? To serve is better than to be served. Right. How did you balance that out at a personal level? I don't want to ask you to be overly personal, but I'm curious. How did you balance that? Yeah.
Well, it was difficult, and you know, I was on a path to be where.
Let me talk about you. Yeah. For Dan, this was really hard. I mean, he went to Yale, he went to Harvard, he could have done anything. He was really committed to serving and to running, and that's why we went back to Michigan to be able to do that. And we went, you know, we lived in Detroit, in the city of Detroit, because we felt like that was where we could have the biggest impact, where we could achieve the goals that we both had of racial justice and economic justice and all of that. And when the party came to me, and I'm sure a lot of that was because they were looking to balance out the ticket and all of that, and they needed a woman who was an attorney, blah, 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 blah. You know, Dan has been incredibly noble throughout this whole thing, and I know it has been a huge prayer journey for him. In fact, the word that he picked up today was sacrifice. I mean, he wouldn't say this, but he has sacrificed enormously to his own achieving self to be able to support the family unit that we have. And it has been just a, you know, I can't even look at him because I'm going to cry.
But and faith was part of that.
Yeah,
sustaining you in sacrifice.
I just, you know, we're all in the room and we're all human beings and we've all had different trials of sorts. And I did pick up the Post-it on the wall, sacrifice this morning. That's what called to me. I gave Jennifer love and I gave Jack journey because he's on a journey. But, you know, I think it's from the Latin sacer, which means sacred or holy, and fice, to make holy. And I think life makes us holy, and it is the burdens oftentimes that we carry and the heartaches that we carry and the broken open heart that makes us holy. And so for me, it was really difficult. And to be a man and watch your wife do work like nobody I've ever seen, and not be able to have success. You know, she was overwhelmingly reelected while our unemployment rate was whatever it was at the time, 8, 9. We had the highest unemployment rate in the country, and Jennifer was elected with more votes than anyone had ever gotten in a governor's race. So it wasn't like it was all doom and gloom or defeat. But in terms of what she was trying to do, and to be a man and not be able to fight back, say anything. I mean, anything that I did.
Oh, yeah, he fought back. He got on the radio, and he had his own radio show, and he was like, boom, 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 to all the callers.
That's not true.
Yes, it is.
That is so not true.
He took out his frustrations on anybody who called. He bit their head off.
That is so not true.
Well, I think next week at 10 we're going to play excerpts of the Dan Mulhern radio show, and we'll just decide for ourselves. You know, we'll just play an hour. And okay, one more. We want to give you a chance to ask some questions, but I do want to ask one other quick question, and then we have to go, and somebody needs to change that clock back an hour because it says 20 of 12. Quickly, and go wherever you want with this, but we've talked a lot about Michigan. You're from California. Differences between Michigan and California in terms of faith communities, in terms of politics. I'm curious the differences between the Midwest and California.
You know, I've been struck. You know, except for this experience here, and we have come here a number of times, and we're very grateful. And Pat, you've just got such an inclusive and warm community here. So thank you for being so embracing of us as outsiders. And we've tried a few Catholic churches as well. I think that the Midwest, the heartland of the country I don't know if there's a greater percentage of people who are going to church on a regular basis or not, but it seems like there is, and that there's a little more of less of a centered church faith community, I'll say, out here, except for right here, of course. I do think that the opportunity here then is really great on the faith side and on the politics side. I mean, we could talk for a long time about the differences between like Michigan and California from a governance perspective. There are challenges in both places, and you'll have the opportunity to address a little bit of that on Tuesday in some of these ballot proposals, I think, which I hope you're all paying attention to. But I won't get into that. I do think that that Michigan and California are both uniquely challenged. California is a place, I think, that has such great bones, but I do think that a lot of the governance structures and the tax structure, et cetera, is a disincentive to creating even greater opportunity here, and I've been surprised by that. You know, in Michigan, our structural changes are due to the concentration we've had in the type of jobs that are going overseas, which are the manufacturing sector. So that's a different policy conversation that I'm sure we could have at a later date.
Okay, let's give all of you a chance to ask some questions. Who has? Just raise your hand. I'll probably repeat it so everybody can hear. Well, oh, there we are. Yeah.
Not that I know of. The question was about Mario Cuomo and whether there was more to this story about worries of exposure of his family. I interviewed him for about an hour for a book on politics and spirituality or character that I never finished. And he was by far the best interview I had ever had. He was, his insight and his faith and his compass was really extraordinary. So and Jennifer spoke last week about his speech at the '84 convention and what an incredible speech that was. So I was always disappointed, and I hope his son is every bit the measure of his father, because he'd be a great, well, he is a leader, he'd be a continued great leader. But I don't know, do you know more about that?
I haven't heard anything other than taking him at his word that it wasn't right for him for whatever reason.
Why didn't you finish the book? I'll buy a copy. You should write this book.
He's got a lot of interviews still in the can.
Yeah.
You know?
More first-person experience now, who knows?
Yeah, all right. Well, hopefully there'll be a book soon. Yes?
I wondered if follow-up to your comments about bridging the divide on a more local level, what would be suggestions for someone, you know, as me, as a member of this congregation, what would be a way that I could bridge?
Can I just say the question for those of you who didn't hear is what's a first step that a person, one of you, could take to help bridge that divide left and right?
Well, and this is more on a church-based level. Is this church member of, is it Gamaliel? Genesis? Are you guys? Yeah, so I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I'll just speak about it in Moses, and you might. There's this movement across the country where faith communities are deciding what they want to see in public policy, and are calling politicians forward to pledge to those pieces of policy, to support those pieces of policy. So what that looks like in Michigan, and I'm sure this is true here as well, is that in Michigan it's called Moses. And all of these churches in Michigan were looking to have sustainable transportation solutions. And so they would, twice a year, have these massive convocations with all of these churches and parishes that signed up to certain principles on transportation. In our case, we don't have any mass transit in Michigan. We wanted to get some mass transit solutions and to have sprawl addressed by building in rather than building out. And so those policy pieces were agreed to by all the members of the faith community, and they would have this twice-a-year gathering where actually they would invite the media to it and invite the politicians. And they would have the politicians, it's kind of Grover Norquistian, but nonetheless it worked, stand up before the community, call them on it, and have them essentially pledge to support these issues of faith. And everybody's looking at you, right? And you are like basically, you know, on my faith, I'm pledging to support these particular policies. And they would have specific bills that they were supporting. And so the folks who came, the politicians who came, were obviously people who were probably generally favorable. But if you didn't come, you were called out. I'm just saying. It was a very effective way of getting stuff done.
Yeah, and to your point, Jennifer's going to this sort of macro level and the way it impacted, but there's a whole story on the micro level about one-to-one relationships, people visiting other people in congregations and sort of rebuilding congregations and asking, what is it that concerns you? And so it was a very incarnate sort of and very grassroots experience of building it bottom up. So it really had both of those implications.
Yeah, do a minute on it.
Thank you. Here. Very quick. Paloma Pavel with Breakthrough Communities, and I had the privilege of interviewing and documenting the event, one of the events that Governor Granholm is referencing, and there is actually a movement here in the Bay Area called Genesis, which is part of the Gamaliel National Network, and we're beginning to work on SB 375, climate change and transportation investments here in the Bay Area. We've had some huge wins, and it's a fabulous interfaith group. It's linking inner city and suburban congregations. We're also working across values organization divides, labor unions, schools, and one of the wins that we've had is with getting an alternative scenario put in front of $277 billion worth of investments that are going to be made in transportation infrastructure, and having an economy, equity, and jobs scenario considered alongside the legislators, and we want to work with this congregation. Yeah, so if you want to see me, breakthroughcommunities.info, breakthroughcommunities.info. The local group is called Genesis, and it's the Bay Area counterpart to Moses, and I just want to honor the work that you have done with faith-based communities as governor. Fix It First is another one that comes to mind. Also the linkage that you did at the Capitol with faith-based groups. It was really revolutionary in the entire United States, and it's such an honor to be with you here this morning.
Thank you. So appreciate it.
Yeah.
I have a question, Governor. I've been really dying to ask this. And this might be a bombshell, so I'm sorry. Benton Harbor, Michigan. What was, in your role as governor, how the legislatures put together that rule that basically unincorporates cities, putting them up for auction, and disenfranchising the voters that live there, particularly in a minority community?
And you're going to have to explain a little background, I think.
Right. So that was after I was governor, just so that you know. Well, whew, but I wouldn't have signed that. I mean, so what happened in Michigan is there's a number of communities that, like in California, are almost ready to declare bankruptcy. And so what the legislature put in place was a way to essentially put in an emergency financial manager that supersedes the mayor and the city council and can break contracts, et cetera, to try to, I mean, the goal is to try to get it on balance. But the effect is that you essentially disenfranchise all of the people who have made decisions, and largely these are placed in minority communities. And so, as you can imagine, there's a huge backlash. In fact, this is on the ballot in Michigan on Tuesday. So there had been an emergency financial manager statute in Michigan when I was governor, but it didn't have the power that the current one does. You put a manager in to work with the mayor and to work with the city council and to, you know, make suggestions about how to, you know, tighten up the financial situation, but it wasn't the draconian thing that's there now, and that's caused the backlash. But I do want to say about Benton Harbor. Benton Harbor in 2003 exploded in a major riot, and Benton Harbor is this tiny little community of 8,000 people on one side of a river across from St. Joseph, which is on the other side. St. Joseph is basically all white, and Benton Harbor is an African-American community. And one hot night in June of 2003, there was a racial incident with police. Police chased a young man, and he was shot. Fires, et cetera. There was a huge amount of anger in the community for a lot of pent-up racial divide. As a result of that, there were buildings that were burned down, and the community was in complete struggle. So this happened my first year in office, and I brought the whole cabinet to Benton Harbor and said, this was the first time a governor had visited Benton Harbor, I don't know in how long, if ever, and we said we're going to make Benton Harbor a project of a community that we want to bring back. We're going to bridge the racial divides, and we're going to lead with the faith community. And the Reverend James Atterbury was my point person in Benton Harbor, and I appointed Reverend Greg Roberts, who was head of my community and faith-based initiatives, to be the link. It's a very faithful community, and the churches are a way to really reach people. It was a fabulous project, but when the emergency financial manager law came in, it created such an undoing of all of this great, the great work that had been undertaken, and so it's frustrating to watch from the outside right now.
One more question, and then we've all got to go to church. Yes.
Very privileged to have you here at Berkeley with all your experience in the department, Robert Reich and others. Must be something big up in your department. What's the intention?
So I have a joint appointment between the law school and the School of Public Policy, and Bob Reich is in the School of Public Policy, and he is a fabulous colleague, and I think the intention at the School of Public Policy is to continue to make it the best School of Public Policy in all of North America, and they want to recruit good people practitioners as well as economists and thinkers to be able to provide students with access to that information.
You didn't even say the best one except for University of Michigan, so you've sort of transplanted yourself now.
Well, their intention is to make it the best in all of North America. I'm sure the University of Michigan has the same intention.
All right.
It is her alma mater.
That's
Berkeley,
true.
after all.
That is true. She is a Berkeley grad. So
Our tuition went all to U of M, but anyway. Those are our
I
kids.
think we should probably all get into church. So please join me for being here both
Thank
weeks.
you
Dan
all.
Mulhern, Jennifer Grant.
Thanks.